series to give you up-to-date information about COVID-19. But the world just keeps changing. And so we are trying to bring you topics that are top of mind. And right now, that is police reform. I am going to provide a brief update from Oakland and particularly around COVID, but I am incredibly honored to be joined tonight by two very special guests and leaders. First, you're going to hear around 6:15 from Chief Ron Davis. Ron was recently appointed by Governor Newsom to develop new standards for California's policing statewide. Chief Davis also led President Barack Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. That was following Ferguson, and departments and cities around the country benefited from his leadership then and now. And of course, we have to acknowledge that Chief Davis started his career right here in Oakland, so he understands the Oakland context. Around 6:30, we'll be introducing our State Senator, Nancy Skinner. She's the author of groundbreaking SB 1421, as well as two new pieces of legislation that would expand police transparency and reform 911 response statewide. Senator Skinner will give an overview of new legislation. She will answer questions that have been submitted to you in advance, but most importantly, I hope that all three of us encourage everyone to get involved in this very important issue and advocate at the state and federal level, as well as at the city level, for change. I want to start by acknowledging just how polarizing the issue of policing is and continues to be. On one hand, we all know stories of officers who have responded in people's darkest moments to their traumas, that have prevented crime from happening, that have brought resolution and healing to victims of crime and their families. We also know, and I will say I just had a poignant conversation this week with young kings that are part of the African American Male Achievement Program at Oakland Unified, who literally shared with me their legitimate fear of leaving the house because they are afraid of police violence and even being murdered, like the countless number of Black men in particular that we have seen victims of police violence and excessive use of force. This is our reality, and we must find a way to move forward with a reimagined sense of public safety. I believe that Oakland was made for this moment. This community has such DNA of social justice and racial justice, and an ability to reimagine a beautiful world where safety is felt by all. With that, I do want to start my update for this week. We all have seen that California is experiencing a horrific surge in COVID-19 cases. Next slide. And while Alameda County has been doing better, we have not been immune by this incredible increase that health officials trace to increased gatherings of family and friends, and particularly vulnerable workers who are being exposed in their workplace, and because of our failure to provide an adequate social safety net and protections, are afraid to stay home from work. Next slide. Alameda County accordingly issued new health orders. Maybe something that many people will be so pleased by is that the Oakland Zoo will be allowed to open as an outdoor museum under special safety guidelines, allowing families to have a safe outdoor space in which they can socially distance and be outdoors and exercise in a way that is advancing public health. However, this new order prohibits places of worship, churches, to have indoor services. Worship can only happen outdoors. It also closed access to indoor malls, but it did reaffirm that outdoor dining is allowed to continue. Next slide. We also welcome 2 new community testing sites in Oakland at the Native American Health Center at 29th and International, a walk-up center, not a drive-up, as well as the parking lot next to the Fruitvale BART, a drive-up testing site run by La Clínica de la Raza. You can contact those organizations directly, or to get a full list of all the free testing sites in Alameda County, please go to ACPHD, as in Alameda County Public Health Department, acphd.org, or call 211. It is really your one-stop shop for information. If you do not have a computer, they can walk you through getting an appointment at any one of these community testing sites. Again, it is free, it is confidential, it is safe, no medical insurance is required, and immigration status is not asked about. It is absolutely confidential and safe for everyone. Next slide. Some good news, just quickly. Oakland received $90 million from the state of California to build 462 units of deeply affordable housing on great public transit. Projects at the Fruitvale BART, West Oakland BART, and along the BRT at 105th. Please, if you're interested in learning how you might get in line for one of these valuable, deeply affordable units. Again, that is for like individuals making less than $19,000 or a family of 3 or 4 making less than $78,000. If you want to find out more about how you might get one of these units, please email housingassistance@oaklandca.gov. That is also your one-stop shop to know your rights as a renter. Next slide. Also, we got a $28.2 million grant for a community-driven initiative to make East Oakland healthier and more resilient. Congratulations to the 5 community groups who led this 3-year effort, resulting in this $28 million investment in our beloved East Oakland. Next slide. And finally, we broke our all-time record of repaving those raggedy roads in Oakland. 26 miles were paved this last fiscal year, an all-time record for Oakland, many of them in East Oakland. Next slide. Also, I announced last week that I have joined Mayor Michael Tubbs. Those of you who tuned into our last town hall learned more about mayors for a guaranteed income, a policy whose time has come, particularly because of COVID, but something that makes sense for equity and fairness and to end poverty. Next slide. And finally, our resource highlight of the week is 211. You can call from anywhere in Alameda County. It is your one-stop resource. If you need housing assistance, if you need to know where you can pick up free groceries, where you can get a free COVID test, anything that you or a loved one needs, 211 is a great one-stop shop. It also has a website with tons of information where you can get help, particularly during this health pandemic. Next slide. That's my update for this week. You are going to hear from these 2 fabulous speakers about police reform, both locally and at the statewide level. Please send us your questions. You can even send comments. You can scan the QR code or text 450-410-464. Text that code to the number 72855. This is your chance to ask questions as well as rate other people's questions so that the highest rated questions get answered first and for sure. So please participate, listen, please put in your questions as we go. And now it is my supreme pleasure to introduce to you Chief Ron Davis, who is going to be leading the state of California, because the state of California always leads in reforming our police and delivering on this promise of a reimagined sense of public safety. Chief Davis, it is always a pleasure. You have been such a valued advisor to me personally during my entire tenure as mayor. It is wonderful to see you leading California at this crucial moment.
Thank you, Mayor. And let me start by thanking you for your leadership. I will correct one thing is if you know anything about California, it will not be led by an individual. It's the collective. So I want to start by thanking the governor for his leadership and recognizing that we're at a specific point in time that we have one of the most unique opportunities in my 35 years since I joined the Oakland Police Department in 1985. Let me start by saying that since 1985, I've watched law enforcement evolve. I've watched the good, I've watched the bad, I've seen the awful. I've seen the impact of a system that is woefully deficient, a system that still suffers from structural racism, a system that people say are broke, but I would offer to you and to the community that the policing system is not broke. It is doing what it's designed to have done going back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It was the tool to enforce Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, and to oppress a community, especially a Black community. Once we start with those truths, Mayor, you know this better than most, then we can start the reconciliation. It was Nelson Mandela that said it best. Only the truth can put the past to rest. As I tell police chiefs all over the country, is the truth often hurts, but selective ignorance is fatal. It's fatal when we pretend not to know our history. It's fatal if we pretend that we don't know the moment that we're in, that we don't see the tragedies. Now, the good opportunity we have is that we know the policing system is flawed. That does not mean that the police themselves are all bad. It means that when you have bad systems, dysfunctional systems, racist systems, even your good cops can have bad outcomes, and your bad cops get to operate with impunity. What the recent tragic murder of George Floyd has done is opened up the lens for most of America to now see why change is necessary. So as I come here tonight, I'm appreciative that I get to talk to the Oakland community from where I started my law enforcement career and be very optimistic that we have a unique opportunity to make the kind of changes, that we know that we need to reimagine what public safety looks like. And I think this can be led, I think it will be led at the local level and at the state level. I mean, what I mean by that is Oakland to be able to sit down and talk about what does public safety look like for the Oakland community? Where do we invest our dollars that will give us the highest return on our investment? What has happened? What failures have occurred that have caused us to over-rely on the police? Now, interesting, in my 35 years in law enforcement, I have not met a police chief or an officer who does not agree with the idea that we have over-relied on police, that we have police going to calls for service, rendering services and aid that we're not qualified to do so. We're not mental health professionals. We're not social workers. And to keep relying on that means that we're taking dollars that could go to those professionals and we're relying on police to do something that they're not trained to do. So we have this unique opportunity to strategically look at it, to reevaluate, to identify where investments should go, to look at strategic plans for the future, to figure out how we're going to reform policing so that when anyone sees a police car, whether they're white or Black, whether they're brown, it does not matter, that the first thing they're going to feel is safe, not fear. And so I think this is a very, very unique opportunity to do that. As I was looking at some of the questions that the community has provided, I'm going to start with the third one. If we go to the slide first, my third one, which is about a question. I'm going to skip around, so I apologize to your team. Will the time come when we seriously talk about completing a completely different system of policing which helps the community and not harm us? That time is now, and we should always be about the good of the community and what's needed to achieve that goal. I'm starting with this question, Mayor, because the time is now that we can have a serious talk about defining the role of police in our community. The only thing I would ask Oakland to take a look at in having this discussion is not a question of police reform. To me, it's a question of policing reform, and why this is different. Policing reform recognizes the systems have failed. Policing reform recognizes the structural deficiencies and racism that I talked about. Police reform attacks the officers and makes all of them bad guys and bad ladies. And we know that's not the case. So I think this is not only a good time to seriously talk about a new system, but to make law enforcement a part of that discussion. It needs to be led by the community, by elected officials, but law enforcement has a stake in it as well. Law enforcement can benefit when it's doing the job that it's trained to do and not the job that it has no expertise to do. Law enforcement benefits when services are available so that a person does not have a mental crisis at 2 o'clock in the morning and the only response you have is the police department. Law enforcement benefits when people have confidence and trust and believe in the police and believe that the laws are going to be fair and enforced impartially. It's safer for the community and it's safer for officers. So I do think this is that time that we can have this talk. We can talk about deconstructing the system as we see it and reconstructing a system while we imagine public safety that provides for public health, public safety. It's interesting that the mayor started with the COVID-19 update. That's a part of public safety. And as we start looking at public safety generally and globally, that would include the response to the disparate impacts of COVID-19. It would include the health disparities in many of our communities. That's why it's great to hear about your $28.2 million grant. It includes the disparity in healthcare and education and economics and a lot of other social conditions that contribute to crime. Once we look at public safety, then we focus on those core issues that go to the heart and soul of crime rather than respond to the symptoms by over-policing communities, taking a lot of people of color to jail, and spending billions of dollars nationally for strategies that do not work. And so if I go to the next question. Go to the next slide, if you will. Thank you. Just kind of got to go forward. Yes. So there's one community member is asking about as we move forward of reimagining policing and we look at reforming police, do we commit to signing a contract that prohibits or waives qualified immunity and paid admin leave when investigating police misconduct? And the concept will be cops know they will not be held responsible for their conduct and that such impunity is harmful to the community and doesn't de-incentivize police violence. I like this question because it is a very tough question. It's a question that we're going to have to face. Many people don't understand qualified immunity, but it wasn't initially designed to protect misconduct or unlawful behavior, right? But if that's what the impact it's having right now, then we need to re-examine it. We need to reform it so that officers are held accountable. Everybody in the community knows that when they commit a crime, when they do some wrongdoing, that they're going to be held accountable, and the police must understand that as well. And that's not unfair. That's not improper. In fact, as a cop for 30-something years, I would say officers should recognize that we must live to an even higher standard because you have entrusted us with such awesome power and responsibility. And so I don't know if it's a signing of a contract, but I think we are going to have to take a look at some of the laws with regards to qualified immunity. And there's at least one bill right now at the federal level called the Justice and Policing Act that looks at reforming qualified immunity as well as some others. If we go to the next question. But de-escalation training, should it be mandatory? Well, each month. California, as always, has taken the lead, and I think de-escalation training is being provided. I don't think it's every month. I don't think it has to be every month. I think it's important to teach officers how to deal with the public, not just from a de-escalation and conflict management, but from a core place of respect. That basically that they should remember that we are here to serve the public. We are public servants. And so we're here to serve them. We're here to be able to provide a service. And when things do get tense, that it's the police responsibility to de-escalate, to escalate the person that's upset and to escalate themselves when the use of force is necessary or in order to prevent the need for force. So I agree with the question or the premise of the question that de-escalation training should be mandatory. I think in California it is mandatory. But I think the second part, I don't want to conflate them. De-escalation is one part of dealing with the public, but we need to go back to some basics and remind officers that how they deal with the public, how they interact with the public, how they treat the public with respect will also evaluate the level of respect they get back from the community. There's a process we have in policing called procedural justice. And what procedural justice suggests is that people are more worried about the process than the outcome. And let me put this in common terms that most of us can understand. If an officer stops you but the officer is rude, is condescending, is preaching to you, is making you feel like a child, although you're an adult, but you still don't get the ticket. You'll still walk away from that encounter very upset, very pissed off, that it was very disrespectful. Whereas if the officer was professional and showed you respect, basically you knew that his enforcement or her enforcement of the law was based on maybe a mistake you made. Even if you get the ticket, we see through evidence and science and research, you'll still have a better interaction and a better outcome and a better view of that officer in the department because of the way you were dealt with. And so I think it's important we look at procedural justice, that inside police departments and outside, that officers remember that in dealing with the public, that procedural justice complies. People comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police. People comply with the law because they believe in that law. They know it's necessary for public safety at large, and they believe that they want the enforcement of it to be fair and impartial. Once you take away that fair and impartial, once you take away their ability to have voice, to explain what happened, to be treated with dignity and respect, then people are less likely to comply. So as we deal with this question, this idea of de-escalating and how to deal with the public, it is at core to why we have some of the challenges we have and why we still need to work on that area. And if I can say this, I'll give Oakland PD a lot of credit. I left Oakland in 2005 to become police chief in East Palo Alto, and the amount of national leading stuff they have done. And I know some people are going to be like, "You're crazy, Chief Davis. We haven't done anything." But I'm going to tell you they have. And I'm not saying that it's perfect, not saying that there's not room for improvement. But one example of this in procedural justice is Oakland took the videos from the body cameras, and instead of just waiting for the tragic shooting or the misconduct to occur, they basically partnered with Stanford and looked at the interaction between the officers and the community and started finding out that implicit bias does play significantly in how people were treated. And they found out that men of color and people of color were treated differently just upon initial contact. A lot of people don't realize they're doing it until you show them, until you identify it. So I think all of this is important in dealing with the public, that we know what our own biases are, that we basically treat our community with dignity and respect. I'm going to end with this so we can hear from our great senator on what legislation he's working on. Is if we don't take advantage of this moment, if we don't put the barriers that have driven us, that have contained us over the last 30 years, if we missed this opportunity. I've been a part of the system for 30 plus years. I've tried to make my own changes. I had some successes, and quite frankly, I've had a lot of failures. I think back to as a rookie during the crack epidemic in Oakland, and us taking thousands of people to jail, and what a mistake that was. And so now we have an opportunity to learn from the past, to listen to these young people that are uprising and are telling us they want a new way, and to reimagine public safety so that it doesn't compromise public safety or a community. It makes it stronger. And if we don't take advantage of that, shame on us. And so I'll close the way I started, which is thank you, Mayor Schaaf, for your leadership and this and many other topics. These are tough discussions, but they have to start somewhere. And I appreciate you for doing it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ron, Chief Davis. Again, you have been a tremendous support to policing and to me personally. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. Shame on us if we don't take advantage of this moment. And I like to say Oakland was made for this moment. So it should be no surprise that Oakland's state senator is leading the conversation in Sacramento about the changes that must be made on the state level. Often the local jurisdictions are restricted in what we can do by state laws. And this is an opportunity to not only remove some of those barriers, but to start creating unified standards across the different departments that each city has. So it is my great honor to introduce a legislative barracuda. I can't think of another way to describe you, Senator Skinner. Our senator, but a real powerhouse in Sacramento. So proud to have you as my senator, Senator Nancy Skinner.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf, and Mr. Davis, Ron Davis, thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion, and also for agreeing to participate in the working group or task force, I can't recall exactly how the governor characterized it, but that he has a set of people who have a great deal of experience in these issues and have expertise to look at what, when we say reforms, I think you had a good distinction between policing reform versus police reform, that we really need to look at the whole way. We could even say community public safety reform in effect, because we cannot achieve public safety in a community without trust between the community and the people that are trying to assist or provide the enforcement or whatever the services related to public safety. Because if there is no trust, then there is no public safety. And I think that's what we have experienced now for years. And it's no good. It doesn't work. And before I start describing some of the bills that not only I'm carrying, but some of my colleagues are, I wanted to reference, and I also want to just go back to thanking Mayor Schaaf for holding these town halls, for giving her, right now, we're all, most of us are doing our best to stay at home as maximum as we can possibly to help not only ourselves not catch COVID, but not give it to others. And it's a challenging time, extremely challenging time. And so these kind of forums are very important for us to be able to come together and not only hear what's happening in our community, but also engage in these issues that we are grappling with. I mean, watching the videos of the murder of George Floyd, I know how it affected me. And yet I am not afraid when a police officer stops me, or if I'm walking down the street and I'm not afraid. And yet I know from not only watching those things and reports, but from my own friends and their descriptions again and again and again of their personal encounters with law enforcement that I would never experience, which is just completely inappropriate. But anyway, we are all grappling with this, something that we've all been grappling with for a long time. But I think because potentially of the pandemic, the George Floyd video was somewhat of a tipping point, because we have more time now to be at home and to reflect, and we're also seeing the incredible racial disparities of who's being affected by the pandemic, who is essential workers, who is getting sick, who is being hospitalized, who is dying, low-income people, people of color, Black and brown people. So these things are so interconnected. But anyway, Mayor Schaaf, thank you very much. Now, back to my comment about some of what Ron Davis raised. We obviously are legitimately focused on the racism that is exhibited by our law enforcement institutions and by individual officers. But I think we also have to look at ourselves. There's much racism that community members also exhibit, that then put the police in a very difficult situation and very often can turn into very bad outcomes. So, for example, we had the situation in the city of Alameda, maybe it was a month ago, where a Black man who, as it's reported later, very commonly does his exercises in a particular location on the street. And yet someone who had not noticed this before, and my understanding, I don't know this for sure, but my understanding is it was a white resident, saw this Black man and called the police. And the police came, and it could have gone very, very, very badly. But he was doing his exercise. That's all he was doing. Now, why was that call made? Now, maybe that call was made because the person was concerned about the individual's welfare. That's possible. But too often, and we know just by when we look at I don't even look at it, to be honest with you, but that blog Nextdoor or whatever it is, where you watch much of the dialogue and it's neighbors who are saying something about, oh, there's a black person who walked down the street who I didn't know. And maybe they call the police on that person. When a white person that they don't know walks down the street and they don't say a word, they don't call the police. So we have to look at our own racism and our reaction, and then our calls to the police, and what kind of circumstances that can then set up. So all of those things are things that we have to grapple with as we grapple with this very real systemic racism that permeates, in effect, all of our institutions, but for which, regardless of it, no one should die at the hands of law enforcement. No one who is unarmed, who has done anything unprovoked, no one. And I basically don't feel that anyone should die at the hands of law enforcement. That's what our judicial system is supposed to do, our justice system. You're innocent until tried. So no one should really be in the situation of ever having the gun shot at them. But unfortunately, sometimes it happens that in maybe legitimate. But we need to get to the place where it never happens. It never happens. So that's what we're working on right now. And last year, we were very fortunate, we, meaning all of California, because Assemblymember Weber brought the bill that changed the use of force. And it was the first time California has changed its standards for when a police officer, a law enforcement official, can use force. Now, at the same time, there was a second bill being carried by Senator Caballero that the approach was primarily, well, let's just do de-escalation training. We don't have to change use of force. We can just improve our training for law enforcement. Well, both of those bills were in my public safety committee, and I conjoined them so that not only would we change the use of force, but that we would also do the training, not only on the new standard, but also on de-escalation. So in the question that Chief Davis answered earlier, yes, California is now doing de-escalation training. Perhaps not frequently enough, but at least we have begun that process and it is required. In addition to those reforms, the year before, as Mayor Schaaf mentioned, I carried the bill SB 1421, which for the first time in over 40 years opened up the door for we, the public, and even police chiefs and others to get access to records on certain types of police misconduct. But it was very, very narrow. And even with that very narrow, it was on deadly use of force, actual sexual assault on the job, and then interfering with the witness or tampering with evidence. That's only records that it would allow. And even with that, I only got the bill through in one of the houses by one extra vote. So, it was a heavy lift. Now, however, and thank you all, those of you who have joined in the street and made it clear that we must pay attention to this moment, that we are all understanding the need for really taking these issues quite seriously. I've now introduced a much broader bill that would give us much more access to law enforcement records. And maybe I'll go to that slide right now and let folks see it. I think it's slide 2 versus slide 1. So yes, here it is. All right, so this new bill, it amends the same parts of California law that 1421 did, but it adds. So now any and all use, if SB 776 is successful, and I just introduced it, we would get access to records of any type of use of force. We would also get records on racist, biased, discriminatory behavior, anti-Semitic behavior like that an officer engaged in such conduct. We would be able to get records on the conducting of wrongful arrests or wrongful searches. We would also, one of the things that happened is that when 1421 got passed, a lot of agencies really didn't want to release records. So they delayed, they charged you a lot of money, they did lots of things. So the bill also includes that the only thing an agency can charge for is to copy the records. And if an agency does not release records, they will have civil fines. And if you have to actually sue them to get the records, there would be penalties would allow to be levied on them for their failure to release records. Additionally, one of the things that we have observed, not just due to 1421, but in general, that certain officers, if they are brought before, if they know they're going to be brought before their internal investigatory misconduct type proceedings, they'll often quit the force. And then there's no paper trail. And they'll go off to another agency, and the new hiring agency won't know anything about them. So what my bill does is requires the agency to create a paper trail, even if the officer's leaving, and even if the investigation's not completed. And then it requires a new agency, before they hire, to request the records from the other agencies that person worked at and review them. So no longer can we have a police chief, for example, or a mayor say, well, we had no idea we had this kind of officer on our force. Now they will know, because they will have to review those records in advance. And additionally, it requires agencies to hold records basically forever. Now that records are digital, there's no need to only have a 5-year hold on them. They would be a permanent record. So that is what I'm trying to achieve with SB 776. And the reason is, we all deserve to know who is policing our communities. And this is one of the ways that we can achieve that. Now I will go to the next slide, which discusses the bill that I have introduced. So Chief Davis talked about this. There are so many incidents where there's no reason to have an armed officer respond, whether it's a mental health incident, whether it's, situations with our homeless people. We don't need to have a police officer respond to all the different kind of calls that 911 gets. And yet we don't have any other system right now. So what my bill does, one might say, well, Senator Skinner, why aren't you just telling every jurisdiction to set up a process where they redirect their 911 calls? The problem with that is that if we do a law like that, then under various other statutes, we would have to cover the cost to every city for whatever activity they engaged in. So instead, the approach that I've taken is, since the state sets the standards for 911 training and 911 dispatchers, that we would begin to set up the process where 911 itself, the dispatchers would be retrained, there would be new standards, and such calls would be redirected. Now, of course, this is partly dependent on our communities being able to establish who they would be redirected to. But that's really the purpose of the bill, is to begin that process where we have statewide the ability for dispatchers to be able to distinguish between calls and not necessarily not go to police officers as the ones to respond if it is not necessary for them to do so. There are many other bills on this subject. My colleague, Assemblymember Kamala Gurdove, has a great bill that would establish grants to community-based organizations so they can begin to fill that need. And that bill also presumes that maybe we shouldn't even be calling 911 for that type of call. And I think I very much support that concept, but I think it might take a long time for us to get to the place where all of us have a different number that we remember to call in an emergency. So I figured that as a sort of compatriot to that move to really restructuring it entirely, that at least we could begin to train our dispatchers and set standards for our dispatchers statewide to begin to get at this issue. Then I'll go to my next slide. And this slide describes, so I'm chair of the Public Safety Committee, and any bill that deals with, when I say any bill that deals with policing reform, there's a few exceptions. If the bill deals only with the civil code, then it goes to the Judicial Committee. But most every criminal justice reform or police reform bill comes before my committee. And I just spent, right before this town hall, a 2-hour phone Zoom meeting with my public safety staff. This was our third call because we have 54 bills from the Assembly. Many of them are gut and amends, meaning they're brand new. No one has heard them. They've not been vetted at all, but many of them are focused on these issues that we've all been discussing for many years, but really at the fore due to the George Floyd situation. Now, if this one will not go before me, my colleague Senator Bradford's police officer decertification, but I wanted to bring it to people's attention because it's been something that many advocates, many community members throughout the East Bay have wanted for a long time. So that one is going to start out in the Assembly, but that's SB 731, and that's a priority of the Black Caucus. And then AB 1775, which is also on 911, is Assemblymember Joan Sawyer. He's the chair of public safety in the Assembly side. He's carrying that, and what that does is, we'll use the example that I think a lot of people remember is the situation of the Black man who was bird watching in Central Park and the woman who basically, literally, to harass him and was explicit about it. She called 911 and in effect faked that he was threatening her and that her life was at risk, and had the police come while he was still there in that situation, it could have gone very, very, very wrong. And so what Assemblymember Joan Sawyer is doing is basically making it the highest penalty misdemeanor for people who make such calls to harass others or who use it in a way that against anyone who is in what we call the protected class under a hate crime. So Black, brown, anti-Semitic, a Muslim, there's many, many categories of those people who are, or those of us who are in a protected class. And there are some other bills in this subject, but that would make such calls a felony. Right now, at least my committee is, we have not been approving any new felonies. We are trying to decarcerate, and felonies we are really trying to eliminate as much as we can any creation of new felonies. So the approach of Mr. Joan Sawyer's bill is a very high penalty misdemeanor, and with including fines and such like that. Then lastly, I want to bring up a bill that I'm co-authoring with Senator Wiener. And before I describe it, there are a number of other bills. There's bills on further reforming the use of force, which both Assemblymember Weber is carrying one, Assemblymember Holden is carrying another one. There's a variety of bills, and the Black Caucus has already, many of them are authored by Black Caucus members, and you can go to the California Legislative Black Caucus website and see a description of the other just very diverse bills in this subject area. But the one I wanted to bring up, the jury pool, because in addition to the racism that we see in policing, we know that the racism is throughout our criminal justice system, to the very point of that you can't even be tried by a jury of your peers. And when you look at the tends to be who's selected on juries, they are whiter and wealthier in California than the population of California as a whole. And part of that, it's not the only reason, but part of that is what lists we draw from for the jury pool. So what this bill does is allows for courts to use state tax filers to be able to send a notice to you being in the jury pool. Because before that, for example, you had on the registered voter. Well, we know that we have a large percent of Californians that don't register to vote. And we do not want to exclude them from the jury pool, or you're going to exclude people from the ability to have a juror of their pool, period. Now, you might think, state tax filers, aren't those wealthy people? But in fact, because California has been expanding, for example, our earned income tax credit, many, many, many more low-income residents are filing state taxes now because they get money for that. So we have a much broader pool of state tax filers. So by expanding that, we may achieve much better justice. Now, Mayor Schaaf, I do not want to go over my time. I could go into some of those questions, but I wanted to check with whether I'm over my time before I went into anything.
Well, I think it's time for us to take some questions. And so I'm sorry that my video is not working for some strange reason, but we will, why don't I ask at this point for viewers, please do the thought exchange slide again. This is a great way for us to capture your questions, your comments. You can, again, vote up or down other people's questions. So please submit your questions through Thought Exchange. Again, you can click on the QR code, click on the link, or if you are calling on the phone but you've got text messaging capacity, please text 450-410-464. Text that number to 72855. And then that will connect you to our Thought Exchange. And we would love to hear your questions and comments. And while we wait for that, and again, I'm sorry that my camera is not working. While we wait for that, I know that I have some questions I've received from ahead of time. So let me start with some of those. While you please put in your good questions. And Ron and Nancy, I might ask you to chime in on some of these as well. The first question is, how can Oakland redirect OPD's budget while still keeping the community safe? Oakland has the highest crime/police ratio in the U.S. and can't even enforce the new parking restrictions at Lake Merritt to keep people safe in a pandemic. I hear a lot of frustration there. I will say that I believe that the City Council did an excellent job in our most recent budget of actually finding savings and cuts in the police budget, but also moving functions. For example, the crossing guard program, the people that hold out those stop signs at intersections by our schools, moving that program out of the police department and into the Department of Transportation. And Chief Davis talked about how our police officers are being asked to do too much, more than they should. And frankly, some functions that maybe could benefit from less of a semi-military law enforcement mindset. And I think crossing guards, I know Berkeley recently passed a resolution to start looking into moving traffic enforcement over to the parking enforcement division. So these are some of the things that we can responsibly do now. I do want to commend the Oakland City Council. A number of members have asked to create a task force to really analyze what the effect would be to cut, for example, half of the police budget. Because to do this in a moment of passion, without analysis and without being transparent to the public about what the actual impacts of these budget decisions will be, is irresponsible. I know there's a lot of talk, and Nancy, your bill kind of lays the groundwork for creating a new non-police response option to 911 calls. But let us be clear, there is no city yet that has that fully up and running. Oakland is ahead of the game. We started the process for creating a mobile crisis response unit 1 year ago. So we actually just completed the feasibility study and survey of best practices. In Oakland, we're going to call it macro. It's inspired by the Cahoots model out of Eugene, Oregon. But that is not up and available yet. So let us not take away police response before we've created something new to take its place. Chief Davis and Senator Skinner, any thoughts about, this is kind of about this call to defund the police, but also a concern that many have argued that Oakland already has defunded their police. We have a very small, hardworking force, and people are afraid of further cuts. So any comments about that?
Mayor, I would say this to the community that, one, there's a distinction between, let's say, reducing the funds of the department versus reallocation of investment or services. In other words, to arbitrarily just decrease the budget without understanding where the money's going to go, how long it's going to take to give you the return on the investment, what kind of impact it's going to have in reducing the law enforcement footprint, what is the transitional period you need in the meantime, then that takes a lot of risk, and you take some public safety risks. The idea of defunding, though, should be more about, as you look at public safety, that's a great idea with the task force, as you look at what you want from the community, what the community says public safety looks like this, then who's best going to get you there? And if you were to take $20 million right now and give it to mental health services, there's got to be the acknowledgement it may take them a year to expend those funds, to build the capacity, provide the services that change so that you don't have people in crisis. If you just cut and apply, there's nothing in between, you take chances. So to be able to look at strategically, it's not to make excuses, it's not to say that we should not reallocate and reduce the law enforcement footprint. I think no one disagrees that we need to reduce the law enforcement footprint, that law enforcement should not be the primary public safety entity. It can be the lead, but it doesn't have to be the biggest. It doesn't have to absorb so much of a general fund budget. But you got to do it strategically. You got to think through. I think I would start off by taking a look at there's some calls right now that you may be able to stop today. In other words, what calls can we just not take? But I would ask the community is, a part of that means, are you willing to not have that service, right? When I was in Oakland for years, people wanted a cop when they called. They didn't want the civilian alternative. They didn't want certain things. They didn't want to go online. They didn't want to send in a report. If we're going to talk about reallocation and defunding, then a part of that is to work and say, okay, we're not going to go to these calls anymore. These calls are going to go to another social services. These calls, technology would pick up, and service may look different. So the community, where if I, as a chief, where I would get concerned is not if you told me, Mayor, that you're going to defund me. It's if you told me you're going to cut my budget, but expect me to do the same thing I did yesterday. Then I have a problem, because that means now we're overtaxed and overburdened, and this department can't win.
Yeah, and I want to add too that the training that you've so well laid out is so important. The de-escalation training, the analysis that we're doing about implicit bias in language, the need for procedural justice. There is a cost to that as well. Senator Skinner, do you have any thoughts about this question?
I do, because I think when we think about a lot of the frustration in our communities, it is both being over-policed and under-policed. So very commonly people feel like, hey, we're over-policed in terms of being harassed, in terms of being pulled over again and again, or getting infractions for, you could say minor or stupid things. And yet serious crime doesn't always get solved. I think if we actually did for many of the folks who are legitimately asking for a defunding, they're asking for, we don't want harassment anymore. But if you ask them, do you want murder solved? I think you would find they want murder solved. We want, not they, we want murder solved. So if we can use our police for those things that we want versus those things that are really creating not only bad will, but very serious consequences to a lot of the residents in our communities, very serious consequences, economic and otherwise, So, it's that thing of what is the policing balance that we want? And I think we want serious crime solved. We don't want to be harassed.
Yep. And, Oakland definitely in partnership with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who you mentioned, Ron, and stay tuned. I did an interview series it's called Oakland Stories, different people that I think are important to Oakland or doing important work in Oakland. And Dr. Eberhardt was my very first interview. We're going to be releasing that next week. So if you haven't had a chance to read her book, Bias, which is excellent, please link a book review or something, or a link to buy that book. It is fabulous. You can watch the interview and get a sense of the very important information that is in her book. The next question I have is, can OPD intervene earlier, become the face of civil order and safety instead of force and violence, after the fact violence? Oakland, a city of color that wants law enforcement to succeed, needs funding support for correct police action, not only criminal focus, but all laws. What do you say to that? I say yes, we can become that face, although I also want to recognize I will confess, I had a moment of hopelessness in talking to these young black men, young black boys, our kings with the African American Male Achievement Program, who have just seen too much, from Trayvon Martin to George Floyd. It is hard to imagine that their trust, that they will ever feel a sense of safety when they see a police officer. Ron, can you give me some hopefulness that OPD could become the face of civil order and safety instead of force?
I'm going to take it a different way. We just talked about reimagining. We talked about potentially deconstructing a current system. And so the real question is, why would we want the police to be the face of public safety when it should be the community is the face of public safety? And the community has several tools to achieve that. And their police department is one of many tools they have to accomplish it. Once again, we have a tendency of wanting to put everything on the police. Now we want them to intervene. We want them to be social workers. I think as we go into this reimagination process, we're going to have to go against our own tendency to want to turn this officer into things that they're not designed to be, and reduce that footprint and have them do very well, to Senator Skinner's point, the things that we want them to do: solve crime, provide public safety from a law enforcement perspective, to work with the community, to have the kind of trust that it's just, we call it the Sir Robert Peel principles, that the police are the public and the public are the police. The police are just the people that you have hired and paid to do something that we all are responsible for. So I know the idea that you want us to, I would say, not so much intervene as can we somehow provide a service that allows us to prevent the crime to be coming from the first place. So crime prevention is one of the tools you can ask for police by collecting data, by analyzing crime trends. You guys do this very well in Oakland, by understanding why people commit crime, by increasing social services and jobs and economic abilities and opportunities. One of the greatest programs I think contributed to crime reductions in East Palo Alto when I was police chief wasn't the addition of cops. It was the implementation and the adoption of a free entry program that reduced the return to custody rate from 70% to 14%. And that had more to do with giving people jobs, opportunities, substance abuse treatment. It was all about community healing and not about taking people to jail. So it was a long way of saying, I see where the questioner wants to go with it. But once again, I don't think we have the legitimacy today, to your point, Mayor, to do that. I think we need to earn that legitimacy by working with the community, reducing our footprint, and being very good at what you want us to do.
Yeah, and just if I can throw in there, you've made several references to reducing the footprint. I do want to highlight that I think Oakland has a good and positive story to tell. Thanks to our work with Dr. Eberhardt, we've changed a lot of our policies around informing people that they have the right to refuse a request to be searched, and specifically reducing the number of discretionary stops, requiring that officers document their actual reason that they base those stops on intelligence. And the first year after we implemented those changes, we saw a 42% reduction in the discretionary stops of African Americans and Blacks in Oakland. 42% reduction in just that first year. And so, and during that same year, we also maintained a huge reduction in crime. As people, I hope, are aware, Oakland cut gun violence in half, much to the credit of the ceasefire approach, which takes a public health approach to gun violence, and is not just an enforcement strategy, but also involves life coaches and assistance, job placement, etc. And so it does show that you can do reform, you can completely shrink your footprint and the oppressive nature of policing, and keep crime down at the same time. Senator Skinner, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you captured that well, and I liked Chief Davis. You had a better phrase than I did: over-policed and under-protected.
Well, I will respond to one more question that I got in advance while the thought exchange magic happens. Hopefully, we're getting some questions in. Maybe my staff can let me know when we're ready to put those up. But I'll put one more advanced question out there. While being respectful of all citizens' rights, how can OPD speed up its response time on calls? It's notoriously slow, especially calls regarding violence or guns in use, causing lack of confidence and disregard for OPD and the law. And I want to acknowledge that we have an unacceptable 911 response rate. There were many concerns and some potential suggestions documented in a recent civil grand jury report. And I can tell you that not only as part of being more responsive as a police department, coming when people call, that is what people want. We also are using this opportunity in doing a full analysis of our 911 calls to also ask the question and get the data to inform it, which of these calls might be better responded to by a non-police response, like a mobile crisis response unit with medics and trained care professionals. And so I think it's exciting that this deep dive into our 911 calls will both hopefully increase that response time, as well as look for opportunities to provide that new form of response. Chief, do you have anything to say about Oakland's 911 response? I'm sure you can remember, I think it is documented that Oakland has more 911 calls per officer than any other city in the country. Any thoughts about how we can be more responsive? People need us to respond when they call.
You do, and I think you started the process by examining to try to find out why. So some of it could be, in other words, is it staffing? Is it that they're so busy that they're already in other calls that they shouldn't be in? And by the time they break from that call, is it consistent? And then a lot of questions would be when people say 911, are you talking, I think you said this though, not every call that comes to 911 should come to 911. Right? And so are you talking about violence? Are you talking about an in-progress crime? People used to get mad when I was in Oakland and when I was in East Palo Alto about how fast a cop got to a drug dealing call. And I have to remind them, is how long have they been dealing drugs in front of your house? For about 2-3 years. Then why is it so important how fast the cop gets there versus whether or not he or she solves the problem? And they're not going to solve the problem by getting there in 2 minutes, because all they can do in 2 minutes is jump out the car and stop and search the person who already got the drug hidden somewhere else. It's about working with the community to find out the information necessary to do thorough investigations and hold people accountable or provide them alternatives. So a lot of this is, and I keep hinting at this, a lot of this reimagination is going to require a reimagination from the community as well. You need to rethink what you want cops to show up on. Now, the violence, domestic violence, and the things you need a cop to be there, you want them there. But a lot of calls, which you may see with your analysis, may not necessarily rise to where they should be 911. And we're just used to evaluating the police. And this is going back to the 80s. How fast you got to the call, how many arrests you made, were what we used to report to the community on a monthly basis. And I don't think either one of them are agencies that necessarily mean success unless you're talking about how fast you got to murders and assaults where people's lives are at risk.
Great. Listen, if my staff can find, they're going to post the chart that shows the reductions in discretionary stops of African Americans and other groups by race. We have 24 questions that we've gotten over Thought Exchange. If we can get through them quickly, we will potentially open up the phone lines for people who only have phone access to ask a question at the end. And then I will ask you to give some parting thoughts before we sign off at 7:30. So we have a lot to do. So please give us the Thought Exchange questions that came through. All right. Chief Davis, I think the first one might be for you. Deholster the police.
So this kind of, I'm assuming that means disarm.
Can you read the question? It says, can we deholster the police? Maybe guns in the car and not so easily accessible all the time.
Yeah, I understand why people would say that, but I do have to say this. Unfortunately, we live in a society where we have more guns than residents. And we have a gun culture that we still have people outside of police violence at 10,000 murders on an annual basis. And I think it wouldn't be prudent to have a cop that, when you talk about responding somewhere, deal with someone coming around a corner or and go be in a car while you have your gun in the car. I don't think it would be fair to the officer who has the right to defend him or herself or the community member that may need it. I think just disarming them is really about trust. You're not trusting them to be armed. We need to deal with that more so than stripping officers from guns. I wish we could get to that point one day, but even in England, they're starting to arm more and more of their officers because of terrorism and other threats.
I have a question that is not on topic tonight about no-shows for building department inspections. Please put our phone number for the office in the chat and our Office of the Mayor email. Please send me your specific concern and we will follow up on that. And that can be true for anything that is not on this topic. Chief and also Senator, there's a question about how police are trained to work particularly with our communities who are disabled or other abled. I know that OPD has an unusual amount of mental health crisis training. We also have liaisons, particularly with our transgender community, to ensure that our officers are sensitive and trained to work with that community. But what are some other practical things and potential legislation that would really help give that sense of safety to our disabled community?
Well, Chief Davis, you can address this, but there is training within what we call POST, that's the statewide training around issues of people with disability, people with mental health. And, I think this is one of these situations where, officers that are not responsive or that basically treat disabled people wrongly, they're not good officers. They're just not good officers. I think we have to be upfront about that. And I think we have to empower the community to be able to complain about such officers. And clearly my records bill would allow us to get more information because disabled people are in that protected class. So that would be one of the type of actions if there was an officer who had a history of those type of actions. So I think that's important. But if I jump, and then Chief Davis maybe want to add, but if we can jump down to that racial profiling, that systemic bias, implicit bias is part of the post training additionally. Now, it's not required, and we had bills to require it. And apologies right now, I believe that the bill to require it may have got hung up in a probe, so I'm not sure. I don't think it was signed into law yet, but it is definitely something that's on the legislature's mind that we must have required implicit bias training. Some individual cities, I believe Oakland has that as a requirement, but many do not. And so we need to make it a requirement as part of post.
Yeah, I want to add, in Oakland, we have a fabulous Department of Race and Equity. The police department has an equity team within the department, and that is part of racial profiling, is also ensuring that your Black officers feel supported and welcome and promoted and supported, so that the change has to start at home, as they say. And if Messiah can throw up that slide, it will show how much of a reduction we've made by some simple policy changes. And I appreciate that. I think both speakers tonight talked about how this is not only about dealing with individuals who have explicit bias, racial bias, but it is recognizing that everyone has implicit or subconscious racial bias, and that we struggle with systemic or structural or institutionalized racism in our institutions. And Ron, you put it beautifully during your introductory remarks, speaking the truth about the racist history of police and how these structures are in there. Ron, do you have something more to add about how we address racial profiling in policing?
Well, before that, I want to go to the one right before that. I come back to profiling with, I think, the one that Senator addressed. A couple of things that recently I found out. This is after 35 years. I sat working a project in Minnesota over the last year, and we heard from autism experts. And when they shared what the symptoms of someone I think they call it an episode, I'm going to use the wrong language. It was shocking, because the symptoms of someone in an episode of autism is the exact same behaviors that cops are taught are the precursors to an attack, which means while this person is having an episode, this officer is now sitting back going, I'm about to get attacked, and they're in two different places. So this is why, once again, if we want to make sure officers understand when someone is in mental crisis or suffering from some type of disability or mental health challenge, that they can understand some of the symptoms. And two, to the extent possible, wouldn't it have been better to have a mental health expert there? So a part of this, because here's what the mental health expert may have access to that the cop does not: records, a history on that family, to be able to say, hey, that's the Davis family. Ron Davis has autism, and he gets like this when he doesn't take his medication. And so before the officer gets there, misread Ron Davis, who's a big guy, looking like I'm about to attack you. And before you know it, you got use and force on me. You have a professional that says, I got this covered. I can de-escalate. I'll take him to the doctor, get his treatment. And that's what the family wanted. They wanted intervention, not uses of force. For the racial profiling, I think it's like anything else. You have to be aware that we all have the implicit bias, Mary, that you talked about. We have to collect the data so that we can show human beings and officers that implicit bias has real effects. And although it may not be intended, it may not have a racial animus. If you're the person getting stopped every day, it feels like racist actions and behaviors, no matter what people say. And for those that have explicit biases, which is racism, you need to collect the data to show that this is a disparity and hold people accountable. The key to all of this is you have to, one, be strong enough as an agency in the city to collect the data, to evaluate the data, and to use it to manage your resources, to hold people accountable, to change training, to change behavior. And if you don't do that, then the profiling will be there. The disparities in Oakland or every major city in this country, although are starting to go down, are still pretty significant, whether it's force, whether it's stops. But what's interesting is the disparities exist until you get to when you start recovering evidence and contraband. Then the disparity just flips, which means you stop more people of color, but you're not getting more contraband. And so that suggests that implicit bias is outweighing what the behavior of the person or the actual real evidence that they were engaged in criminal behavior to begin with.
That's right. And while my staff puts back up the thought exchange questions, I also want to recognize the great leadership of our Citizen Police Commission here in Oakland. And they recently passed forward a policy that no longer allows automatic searches of anyone on probation or parole. And that's a good example of institutional racism. When we know that our criminal justice system has racial bias embedded in it, when we perpetuate that racial bias to policies like continual and like for no reason, anytime searches of people on probation or parole, that is an extension of that profiling and structural racism. So kudos to our police commission for changing that policy. That's another example of ways that we can address and reduce profiling.
And Mayor, for me real quick, just that probation also brings into mind is how people get on probation, which means as we look at our cash bail system, that you have a lot of people that are in pre-trial detainment. In other words, they've been charged with a crime but not convicted. They're in jail because they can't afford the bail, even though they may pose no threat to the community. And after 2 or 3 months, someone comes to them and says, hey, if you plead guilty, you can go home. Time served. And people start pleading guilty. So now a couple of things happen. It's harder to find a jury pool. They get a pool of their peers. It's hard to vote because now you've a convicted felon, right? And you have a whole bunch of other disparities that you're on probation, which means every time you get stopped, now you've given yourself a 3-way search where I can search you, your car, and your home. And a person doesn't know that when they just want to go home to their family. So all this is linked. When we look at reimagining public safety, it's got to go even higher to looking at the criminal justice system as a whole. That link it cannot be broken.
And Senator Skinner, maybe you can say why Californians should be proud that we just eliminated cash bail.
That's right.
Well, not only did we eliminate cash bail, but I wanted to clarify, and I'm sure Chief Davis knows this, but a lot of people don't, is that if you have been convicted of a felony in California, you can vote. The only prohibition on your voting is if you are on parole or probation. So if you're still considered supervised. But the legislature did pass, and we will have on the ballot in November the ability for us to allow even people who are on probation and parole to vote, which I think is very important when you look at who is put on parole and probation, and exactly for the reasons that Chief Davis mentioned. They may not even have been guilty of that crime. They just to get out of jail, they're avoiding the whole process of going to court because they need to get home. They need to be to start supporting their families again. And so then they have that tail of a crime then on their record, which they might not have otherwise had, which then has all kinds of consequences, as we know. So anyway, just wanted to clarify that and also let people know that there will be that opportunity. Then the other thing I want to just throw in, because there was a question up here on reparations, but my colleague, who is also chair of the Black Caucus, Assembly Member Shirley Weber, has a bill this year basically asking the legislature to set up a process in California for California to have a commission to begin to look at reparations for descendants of slaves.
And I can say that the city of Oakland has formally endorsed that, as well as the federal legislation by our Congresswoman, Barbara Lee. I personally fully support truth and reconciliation as well as reparations, which can be done through policy as well as other ways. But it's a conversation that we have to have. Chief Davis, I think the next two questions could kind of be combined and answered by you about how can the police gain back the trust of a community that they have constantly harassed and hurt? How do you change the mindset of police? They don't view Black and brown people as human beings with rights. To bring about real change, it can't just be training. Over-policing has a lot to do with how people are viewed. Can you respond to those two questions?
Yeah, let me start with the trust part. I think this is the lesson, like you mentioned, truth and reconciliation. And as a country, this is something we have yet to do from the original sin of slavery. We have not gone through a truth and reconciliation process. So we're still, as a country, in denial about our own history. We still try to rewrite history. And so the first thing I think law enforcement can do and should do to earn the trust of the community is to acknowledge the truth. Right, to acknowledge what role we played in the oppression of communities of color and in kicking people off the back of the bus and preventing them from demonstrating and making sure they couldn't vote. what role we play today, that our crime policies have resulted in the mass and disparate incarceration of young men and women of color. Is that the acknowledgement of the reality that people live every day is the first way to do it. Then the commitment to make a change. And then, like most young people would tell me, all my three kids are all grown, but they're millennials. They want to hear authenticity and they want to see action. Words are cheap. So you can acknowledge, you can apologize, you can make the commitment, but then there's got to be measurable action that shows that we're going to make a difference. And a part of that is that if you don't see Black folk as human, that's a character flaw that there is no training for. That's the part we need to weed out from a psychological point of view, from a hiring point of view. You know, as one of the biggest challenges I've had in my 30 years is I have 3 different perspectives. They're very unique. And hopefully your team will share an article, op-ed I wrote last year called My Truth as a Black man and a Black cop in the Huffington Post. And it talks about the reality, the truth I had to deal with to try to reconcile that I know what it's like to be a Black man and be profiled. I know what it's like to be a father of Black children and having to have a talk with them before I let them drive the car when they were that age that they were getting a driver's license. And I had to protect them from people that I respected that wore the same uniform that I wore. And I also know what it's like to be a cop and to know the challenges of the job. And I've worked with no more honorable people than the men and women that I've served with over 37 years. And so instead of trying to rewrite history to fit those narratives in there, I accept each for the truth that they represent, which is that most cops are good people, but some are not. The systems are very flawed and they have disparate outcomes, right? And that Black communities are treated and have been historically very badly. I think if we start acknowledging that, the community may have some sliver of truth, but regardless, as far as looking at Black people as humans, you know, if you can't value the sanctity of life of everyone, then this is not the job for you.
Thank you. Amen. I know that we're getting close to our end of time. I wanted to see if there's anyone on the phone line that had a burning question, if staff can make that inquiry. If someone is on the phone line and wants to ask a question, this is your opportunity. And while we wait just a second to hear if anybody, I think they will just unmute the phone lines, and so you can speak up if you have a question. I see the question about more enforcement during shelter in place on Lakeshore Avenue. I will look into that. Particularly vending, we are not allowing unpermitted vending. We are definitely cracking down on that. But I will say I don't think stressed out people who are not working need a ticket or a fine or to get arrested right now. So we're trying to educate, warn, cajole, but anybody who's making money improperly. All right, someone's on the phone who has a question. Go ahead. All right. Hearing none, I will invite each of you to just give very brief 2-minute remarks as we wrap up and call it a night. Thank you. I think people have learned a lot. Yes? Do you have a question? Hello?
Yes, hi, Libby.
Hi.
Hi, Libby. How are you?
I'm good.
I wanted to ask a question.
Go ahead.
How can our society... According to a 2005 study, changing the gender makeup of law enforcement has shown to have a significant impact on lethal force. How are you going to address that California's less than 14% of sworn officers are female, and even fewer are women of color? What will you do to change a culture of policing from the ground up, starting with recruitment, to make sure that women are drawn to serve and are supported in their career choice? And I'll mute myself.
That is a phenomenal question, and I could not agree with you more. I think I've been somewhat outspoken to talk about the toxic macho culture in police, although frankly it permeates all of society, but that culture is particularly there in policing. Certainly we are tracking and doing a lot of different things to proactively attract more women of color. Chief Davis, what are the policies that you believe that cities and states can enact to attract more women into law enforcement?
First, let me say the caller was 100% right. There's actually research that shows more women in police departments result in less uses of force. which makes sense. And I'm glad you said it, because I'm going to say it now. It's because women don't suffer from the machismo effect where they got to just, everything's got to be, I told you so, or I do what I told you. And so they use communication skills and thinking skills and analytical skills to resolve problems that in cases, sometimes guys do not. And I'm going to piss off a lot of guys with that, but these are the facts. I think what we have to do to get women in policing, and nationally it's about 12 to 13%. One, we need to make sure that the environment is for them. What I mean by that is we don't want to give people this is for men and women, but it affects women more, is that you should not have to sacrifice a family to be a police officer. And we're going to have to rethink about how we have services and departments, whether it's child care, whether it's split work shifts, whether it's different adjustments that would meet this generation of millennials, that we're not just having trouble recruiting women, but recruiting a period that don't want to work the traditional 30 years in one place doing the same thing and can't take family leave. So we're going to have to, as you look at the departments, to get that new generation, especially women, to make sure that it's inviting to women, that a woman can take a look at the department and say, I fit there, I'll succeed there, I can still have everything I want outside of the work, and I don't have to compromise that. And until we get to that point, then you have this male-dominant, very paramilitaristic field that basically says you can come here if you want, but you got to give me other stuff.
So I would add, so we just recently in the state Senate, the state Senate approves the appointments the governor makes. And the governor just recommended an appointment of our first black head of the California Highway Patrol, CHP. And we asked for a breakdown of CHP officers. And we saw that statewide, CHP really seriously lacks diversity. Not only by gender, very, very few female CHP, but it's a very dominantly white force. And so we had not asked for that in a while. And so one of our focuses with that new head is to begin to diversify our CHP and the California Highway Patrol. And exactly how to, I think, is one of those questions that we are going to have to grapple with. And to do it seriously, as I said it at a hearing recently, it wasn't about this, but about something else. We don't want just words. And so we really have to think about how do we, another thing that's going to be on the ballot is affirmative action. Because, for example, if we take most of our higher education, they also say they are committed. They're dedicated to trying to have diversity within their student population, their faculty population, and yet we don't see it. It's not there. So the legislature has put back on the ballot, get rid of Prop 209. So it's similar within these institutions like the California Highway Patrol, police agencies, many, many, many. And so we may have to think of whole new requirements or tools in order to achieve it.
Amen. We cannot address structural racism without addressing race. And that is what the repeal of Prop 209 will help us do. It is very important. Again, I'm so thankful to you, Senator Skinner, and to our legislature for taking some truly bold moves this year. And my chief texted me to make sure people know that we are doing a very targeted recruitment specifically for African-American women right now. And I want to recognize our fabulous Deputy Chief, Drennan Lindsay, who is herself an African-American woman who is leading that effort. I also want to lay claim to the Chief of Police for Philadelphia. I think it's the third largest city in the country, an Oakland native, Daniel Outlaw. She started as a cadet in the Oakland Police Department, now runs one of the largest departments in the country and is doing it very beautifully. So with that, I know it is 7:30. I think you all gave wonderful remarks in your last answers. Chief Davis, what an honor to have you. Thank you and Godspeed with the important work you're doing on behalf of all Californians. And Senator Skinner, we are so proud that you represent us so well. And again, much more work to do, But thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next town hall.